Buddha's warning, even Arahants make mistakes, test everything. One of the most important principles in meditating on the breath is learning how to experiment with it. Try different kinds of breathing to see which rhythm, which texture of breathing feels best for the body right now, and which is also best for the mind. Some ways of breathing can put you to sleep. Other ways of breathing get you irritated, so you want to check and see what kind of breathing is going to make it easiest for the mind to settle down in a state of mindful alertness and want to stay there. If the body is uncomfortable because of the way you breathe, you're not taking advantage of the fact that the breath can make it comfortable. I know a lot of people who are surprised by this aspect of Ajahn Lee's instructions for breath meditation. They come to meditation with the idea that you're supposed to let things simply happen on their own and not do anything to them, that you just watch the breath however it comes in, however it goes out. But even the Buddha's instructions on breath meditation frequently state that you train yourself to do things in a certain way. You train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, aware of the whole body as you breathe out. You train yourself so that the breath calms down, giving rise to the next steps, where you can train yourself to breathe in with a sense of ease, with a sense of rapture, and then you can calm those feelings. The Buddha never taught the three characteristics, the real context. There's an element of will in all this, an element of fabrication in which you intentionally cause things to happen. That's important for not only getting the mind to settle down with a sense of ease, but also for developing insight, because insight comes down to a matter of seeing cause and effect. I think it was Aristotle who defined intelligence as the ability to see connections. When you do X, Y happens. When you do Z, W happens. The ability to see that on your own is a sign of intelligence, and that sort of intelligence can be developed by learning to look for causes and effects. This is how you do it. You change certain things and see where the change has an impact. You change other things and see where that has an impact. If changing X causes Y to change every time, you know that X is a condition for Y. This principle permeates all of the Buddha's teachings. Everything is checked by the results it gives. When the Buddha was teaching his aunt the basic principles of the Dharma, it came down to this. When you adopt a particular teaching, what effect does it have? Does it give rise to passion, to being fettered, to accumulating, to self-aggrandizement, to discontent, to entanglement, to laziness, to being burdensome? Then that's a wrong teaching. Does it give rise to the opposite qualities such as dispassion, modesty, and not being fettered? Okay, that's a right teaching. That's how you know what's Dhamma and what's not. You take all the Dhamma you hear and you test it in terms of cause and effect. You don't take anything for granted just because you've heard that it's so. Sometimes we hear that the basic Buddhist insight is into the three characteristics, inconstancy, stress, not self, which doesn't seem to involve many connections between cause and effect. But here, you have to remember two things. One, the Buddha never talked about three characteristics. The phrase three characteristics doesn't appear in his teachings. That was something added later in the commentaries. He taught these three themes, inconstancy, stress, not self, as perceptions and contemplations, as labels you apply to things and aspects you look for in your experience of things. But there's a larger context for looking for these things, or learning to see things in light of them. The larger context is formed by the Four Noble Truths. The fact that there is suffering, that there's a cause for suffering, that suffering can cease, and that there's a path of practice leading to its cessation. These truths in turn relate to a more basic issue, that the whole purpose of the Buddha's teachings is for the sake of finding true happiness, and he brings both the heart and the head together on this project. The heart's basic desire is for happiness with the least amount of effort, whereas the head is the part that recognizes that there are causes and effects, and that if you want to get anywhere, you have to learn this pattern and work within it. In following the Buddha's teachings, these two sides of your awareness, heart and head, have to learn to work together. The heart has to learn respect for the fact that if you want true happiness, it's going to require some work. You'll have to get the causes right. At the same time, the head has to recognize that true happiness is a worthwhile goal. You don't just think about things and analyze them just for the sake of spinning out ideas and showing you're smart. You want to understand cause and effect so that you can find true happiness. And as the Buddha traces out the causes of suffering, one of the big causes is clinging. So one way of learning how to let go of clinging is to see things in light of those three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self. You don't stop with just seeing things in terms of those perceptions. At the same time, you have to learn the right time and place to apply them, when they actually serve the purpose of leading to a greater happiness. All the teachings have their time and place. You have to see each teaching in the larger structure of this pursuit of happiness and try to apply it in an intelligent way. A large part of this means that you have to be heedful. You can't just assume that anything that comes popping up in your mind or any idea that you have is going to lead to true happiness. You can't assume that any teaching you receive from anybody is going to lead to true happiness, or that you can apply it willy-nilly to everything that comes up. You have to test things to learn when and how they work. So, a central part of the Buddha's teaching consists of instructions in the best way to test things. You start out by getting the mind to be still. Get it into strong states of concentration where everything is very, very still, so that you can observe when a thought comes into the mind, what it does to the mind, or when you do an action, what it does to the mind. If things aren't really still, you can't see the impact of a thought, the impact of an action very clearly. It's like trying to listen to a very soft piece of music on the stereo at the same time that you've got a lawnmower outside or trucks driving up and down the road. The background noise is so loud that it obscures the subtleties you're trying to hear. The same way with the mind. Unless you can get the mind really, really still, you can't really watch the effects of your actions, the effects of your words, the effects of your thoughts. Many actions may seem perfectly harmless in an ordinary state of mind, but when the mind gets really, really still, you begin to see that they actually have an adverse impact on the mind. So this is why we work at bringing the mind to concentration. This is why the Buddha said that concentration should be developed. He didn't say, states of concentration come and go. You just watch their coming and going and say, ah, yes, this is inconstant, stressful, not self. That's not the duty that the Four Noble Truths assign to concentration. The duty they assign is that when you encounter states of mindfulness, you try to develop them. When you encounter states of concentration, you try to develop them. Make them stronger because you're going to need them as tools. Whatever serves as a tool on the path, you want to take care of it. You don't just let it go. The same with the breath. You work with it, you take care of it, because it's going to help you get the mind to settle down. It's going to help give you a good, solid foundation. I know someone who went to study in Thailand after she'd been doing the Ajahn Lee method. She met a teacher who said, "What is this? Improving the breath. You're supposed to let it go and be on its own. After all, it's just a sankhara, just a fabrication. Why try to improve it?" She reported to me what he had said. My response was, "Go back and ask him, why bathe your body? After all, it's just a sankhara, just let it go." Of course you can't do that. You've got to look after the body because you're using it as a tool. The same with the breath. You look after the breath, tend to it, because it helps the mind to settle down with a sense of ease and solidity that you're going to need for deeper insights. At the same time as you're working with the breath, you get insight into cause and effect. Because even when the mind settles down and you see things, you've got to test them. Sometimes you hear the teaching that once the mind settles down, you get in touch with your Buddha nature or your inner stillness, and you can trust whatever your Buddha nature or inner stillness tells you. The Buddha never taught that way. Even stream enterers, he said, have got to be heedful. You can't trust everything that comes out of the mind. He even said that Arahants had to be heedful about their actions. Even totally enlightened beings can't totally assume that everything they see or hear is actually the way it is. They have to test it. Go look in the Vinaya. A couple of the rules were actually formulated because some Arahants made some mistakes. For instance, there's the rule against monks eating stored-up food. Then, Bellattasisa, who was an Arahant, figured, well, I can just go for alms once a week, take the leftover rice and dry it. That's a nice frugal way of living, and I don't have to go out for alms every day. Just eat the leftover rice from the days before. The Buddha found out about it and took him to task. He said, this is not a wise course of action. The story doesn't explain what the Buddha's reasoning was, but if you look at the history of Buddhism, you see that down the line in later centuries, when monks stopped going for alms, they created a rift in the Buddhist community at large. The monks lived on their own. They had their own kitchens with monastery attendants to fix their food. Lay people basically stopped caring about the monks. And as a result, when the Muslims came into India and destroyed the monasteries, the lay people didn't really care. The connection had been severed. The Buddha saw that far ahead. So even fully awakened Arahants can't always assume that what they think is true. They've got to test it and check it just like everybody else. So when insights arise in your meditation, or when you gain an intuitive feel for something, the question is not where the insight comes from, but what happens when you apply it. You view it as a hypothesis in an experiment. You're developing an experimental intelligence here. You take the passages you read in the texts and you experiment with them. You take the insights you receive from meditation and you experiment with them. There's a passage in the very first sutta in the Digha Nikaya listing all the different kinds of wrong views that people can develop. And not every wrong view comes from people simply thinking things out without having practiced meditation. A lot of wrong views come from people who meditate and gain some insights or intuitive knowledge, but the knowledge isn't as complete as they thought it was, so they jump to the wrong conclusions. What this means is that whether the source of your insight is something you've learned from the texts, something you've thought out on your own, an intuitive feeling you have, or something that comes up in your meditation, you always have to test it to see. If I adopt this, where does it go? What does it connect with? What are the connections here in terms of cause and effect? That's how you test to see, in terms of the insights you gain, which ones are fool's gold and which ones are genuine gold. You put them to use and then see what happens. And you always adopt the heedful attitude that says, I'm testing things here. I won't draw any firm conclusions until I've seen what actually works in freeing the mind. As the Buddha says, just because you like a particular truth or it seems to fit in with your worldview, that's no guarantee that it's actually true. We've all read the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha says not to take religious texts as being necessarily true. That's the part everybody seems to remember. The other part, though, is that he also says not to take what you like as necessarily being true. Don't take what seems to fit into your worldview as true. Don't take what seems to work out logically as necessarily being true. You've got to test things. When you adopt this or that idea, this or that practice, what happens? Check these things out not only against your own experience, but also against the experience of wise people. In this way, you're much more likely to find truths that really are true because they've stood up to the test. Of course, this means we have to be very careful in how we conduct our tests, which again is why we work at developing concentration, developing mindfulness, all the mental attributes of patience, endurance, alertness, honesty, and discernment. They put us in a position where we can test things and evaluate the results reliably, so that we're not overcome by bias, and we can overcome the limitations of the worldviews and ideas we bring to the practice. After all, the purpose of the practice is to see things we've never seen before, to attain things we've never attained before. That means you have to learn how to overcome the limitations of your assumptions. And this is how you do it. You adopt this experimental way of developing intelligence so that your heart's desire, a true happiness, will get fulfilled, even if it's not quite in the way you might have wanted it. After all, this does require work, but it's a path of work and of effort that leads ultimately to a happiness that, once you've attained it, doesn't require any effort to maintain. Only through gaining intelligence in terms of cause and effect can you find the happiness that ultimately lies beyond cause and effect. So we work with the nitty-gritty of just learning to observe what's going on in the mind, testing it, learning to put away whatever assumptions don't pass the test, because only through working through the details like this do we ultimately break through to something much larger and more lasting. The path of mistakes. An essential aspect of Buddhist practice is that we have to learn how to make use of things we'll eventually have to learn how to let go of. We know that at some point the practice involves letting go of desire, but we need to cultivate skillful desire to get to that point. Ultimately, the practice leads to the total end of fabrication, but the Noble Eightfold Path is a type of fabrication. As the Buddha once said, it's the ultimate level of fabrication. In fact, when you look at the factors of the path, you realize that they're made up of the aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. These all have to play a role in the path, which means we have to learn how to change our attitude toward the aggregates. Instead of just clinging to them as us or ours, we learn how to use them as elements in the path. The important point here is to realize that these things have to be used in a skillful way. When you come to the path, it's useful to reflect on skills you've developed in the past, as an artist, a cook, a carpenter, or a musician. Whatever skills you've worked on in the past, it's good to reflect on how you became skillful, and particularly how you learned how to deal with mistakes. Learning from your mistakes is essential to developing any kind of skill. It's expected that you're going to make mistakes. The teacher tries to help you avoid the really unnecessary ones by pointing them out in advance. In other words, some mistakes are more avoidable than others. But a large part of the practice lies in learning how to learn from your mistakes and not get knocked off course by them. We all like to hear that there's a stage in the practice when you finally attain a certain level of awareness, a certain level of insight, and it's guaranteed that from that point on, nothing you might do would be a mistake. You may have heard about the choicelessness of the path. You finally get on the path and realize that there's only one thing to do. If you just do what the path tells you to do, or what seems right at any one time, you're guaranteed that there will be no mistakes. But that's not the way it works. Even Arahants make mistakes. Their virtues in terms of the basics of a virtuous life, the 5 precepts, are unshakable. They don't make those mistakes anymore, but simple mistakes in saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. That's human. It has nothing to do with defilements of the mind. It's simply the fact that we're human beings with limitations. What's different about Arahants is that they continue to learn from their mistakes. They don't get knocked off course by them because they have no conceit that's going to be challenged by the mistake, destroyed by the mistake, or feel threatened by the mistake. But for those of us on the path, that's an issue we still have to deal with. This issue of conceit, our narcissism. We don't like the thought of having to make mistakes, but there's no other way we're going to learn. This is why the Buddha gives so many instructions on how to learn from your mistakes, how to deal with a mistake so that it actually becomes an important element in the path. There are the instructions to Rahula. When you realize you've done something that's been harmful, you resolve not to repeat it. You also go talk it over with other people who are on the path to see what insight you can gain from them. In other words, you admit the mistake, you learn how to recognize it, and that involves developing a certain amount of perceptiveness right there. And as for learning from the counsel of others, we sometimes assume that the Buddha's instructions to the Kalamas tell you to go by your own sense of right and wrong. But in fact, if you look carefully at his words, you realize that this assumption has nothing to do with what the Buddha actually said. He said that you can't go totally on the instructions of others, but you can't go on your own preconceived ideas about what's right and wrong either. You have to look at what you're doing, along with the results of what you're doing and what you've done. Then learn to recognize when you've caused harm and when you haven't. At the same time, you take into consideration the counsel of the wise. That, of course, requires you to learn how to recognize who's wise and who's not. So in one way, it does throw the whole issue back on you, but it's not that you have to totally reinvent the Dhamma wheel as you practice. There is guidance, and when you learn how to make the best use of guidance, it gives you quite a leg up. There's another passage where a student of the Jains comes to the Buddha. The Jains were teaching that whoever kills, steals, has illicit sex, tells lies, or takes intoxicants is going to go to hell. This person wanted to know what the Buddha had to say about that, and the Buddha replied that if you hear that teaching and you realize you've done these things in the past, that pretty much consigns you to hell right there. It makes things hopeless. This is why the Buddha taught in a different way. He taught that these activities are unwise. They should be avoided because they cause harm. You look at what you've done and you realize you've made mistakes like this. So what's the proper attitude to develop toward those mistakes? It's to resolve not to do them again. At the same time, you realize that if you let yourself get tied up in remorse about your past mistakes, it's not going to undo the old mistake, and it's going to make it less likely that you're going to do well in the future, because remorse saps your strength. The proper attitude is to learn how to recognize a mistake and simply resolve, I'm not going to repeat it. The next step is to develop the sublime attitudes: limitless goodwill, limitless compassion, limitless empathetic joy, limitless equanimity. Learn how to cultivate these emotions because they help keep you on the right track, strengthen your resolve not to be harmful, and also teach you where your limitations are, what you can do, what you can't do in terms of correcting the situation within yourself and the world around you. Again, these attitudes too are fabrications. It's not that our nature is innately kind or innately bad. These attitudes are things you have to learn how to cultivate. They're fabrications. So what happens when you come up against some ill will inside you, some resentment, or an inability to accept the situation as it is? When you look at that emotion, you realize it's composed of all the different elements of fabrication. There's the way you breathe. There are the directed thoughts, the way you direct your thinking around that topic. There's the way you evaluate what's happening, and there are also your feelings and perceptions about what's happening. These are all the elements of fabrication that go into any thought, any emotion. So, to begin with, you want to learn how to take your unskillful emotions apart. When you find yourself thinking in an unskillful way, when an unskillful emotion comes up with regard either to yourself or somebody else, ask yourself, what kind of breathing is going on here? How does the breathing affect that emotion? What if I were to make the breath more skillful, making it smooth, making it full, making it restful. Will that help get the body out of the grip of the emotion? Then look at how you're thinking about the issue. Is there some way you could change your thoughts about the issue? Look at it from a different perspective. A lot of the Buddha's teachings, say, on anger, are just that. Look at the situation from another angle. Look at the good in the people who make you angry. After all, you need their good as much as they do. If all you can see are the bad traits of other people, it's like being in a desert. You're hot, tired, trembling, thirsty, and the goodness of other people is like water. You're not in some Olympian position where you can look down on the human race and say, well, they're bad, and these people are bad, and those people are bad, and it doesn't affect you at all. It does affect you to be constantly focusing on other people's bad habits. It's like that New Yorker cartoon of the two female poodles sitting at a bar with grim, sneering looks on their faces saying, they're all sons of bitches. When everyone is a son of a bitch, what does that make you? So try to think about the situation in a way that helps you realize that you need the water of their goodness. This waters the goodness of your own heart, this change in the element of perception along with directed thought and evaluation. As for the feelings that come up, learn not to identify with them. Just watch them. Okay, these feelings are results of actions. They, in and of themselves, are not skillful or unskillful, but the way you perceive them and the thoughts you build around them, those can be skillful and unskillful. So learn how to step back. In this way, you use your understanding of fabrication to deconstruct unskillful emotions, unskillful mind states, and then to develop skillful emotions and skillful mind states in their place. We don't usually like the idea of constructing an emotion or fabricating an emotion. It seems too artificial, but we do it all the time. It's simply that we're not conscious of it. So as you're meditating, what are you doing? You're working with the breath. That's one form of fabrication. Try to make the breath comfortable. When there's a sense of tension anywhere in the body, learn how to breathe around it or breathe through it to relieve as much of the tension as you can without totally losing focus. You direct your thoughts to the breath. You evaluate the breath. What kind of breathing feels good right now? This is an important part of the practice because it teaches you how to develop your powers of observation on a subtle level. You're learning to recognize your actions and their results. You're learning how to read those actions, read those results. And if the results aren't what you want, you can think of ways of improving them. That all comes under evaluation. Then there are feelings. You try to work with the breath in such a way as to develop feelings of ease and fullness. There are also perceptions. How do you perceive your breath? What mental picture do you have of the breath? How does that mental picture affect the way you actually breathe? Can you think of the breath as an energy field in the body? That your whole awareness of the body right now is all breath, different levels of breath energy? If you apply that perception, hold that label in mind, and explore the way you feel the body from the inside. What does it do? You can think of the body as a big sponge. Lots of holes for the breath to come in and out from all directions. The breath comes in and goes out without any sense of blockage, no problem at all. If you perceived it that way, what impact would it have on how you actually experience the breath? In other words, you learn to take these aspects of fabrication and use them to your advantage. And of course you're going to make mistakes, but you can learn from them. By learning how to notice things on your own, knowing how to seek advice from other people, learning how to apply their advice in a skillful way. So, on the one hand, the Buddha gives you a lot of instructions on how to avoid mistakes, but he also is very open to the fact that we're still going to make mistakes on one level or another. Instead of forbidding you from making mistakes, he gives you advice. When you make a mistake, this is how you handle it. This is how you learn from it so you can become more skillful. This is how the process of fabrication can take you to the threshold where there's the unfabricated, You develop your tools, and, as with any art, you're not developing the tools because you want to take the tools with you. Say, for instance, you have some paint brushes. You're not painting for the sake of paintbrushes. You use the paintbrushes for the sake of the art. And as you master the use of those paintbrushes, there comes a point where you've finished your artwork and you put the brushes aside. It's the same with the path. You work on developing these elements of the path. Learn how to notice when you've done it well and when you haven't. In that way, you develop your skill. This skill, though, is special. It takes you to the threshold of the unfabricated. But you can't use the unfabricated to get to the unfabricated. It can't be used as a cause at all, for it lies totally outside of the realm of causality. But you can get there through causality, through learning fabrication as you learn to fabricate states of mind more and more skillfully. So don't be afraid of mistakes. Try to avoid them as much as you can, but don't be afraid of the idea that there will be mistakes down the line. As Ajahn Fuang once said, no matter what happens in the meditation, there's always a cure for it, if you develop the right attitude. So the conceit that says, I don't want to make any mistakes, and simply wanting to will your way to a mistake-free life without doing anything, that you've got to put aside. The narcissism of not wanting anyone to be able to criticize you, that you've got to put aside. As the Buddha once said, if someone points out your faults, regard that person as someone who's pointed out treasure. So learn to live with the fact that, yes, we all make mistakes. Even Arahants make some mistakes. But a mistake is not the end of the world. It's a start. It's a treasure in that it's your opportunity to. One point, 2 points, many points. Ajahn Lee sometimes talks about not being aware of the breath in the whole body. He sometimes recommends focusing on one spot and just staying right there. Some people, he says, find it too distracting to deal with the breath sensations in the different parts of the body. As you're thinking about your hand, your arm, or your leg, other thoughts related to hands, arms, and legs might sneak in and carry you off someplace else. He compares this to starting an orchard. If you plant your whole orchard all at once, using all your resources, you may find that you've overextended yourself. You're faced with a drought for several days, the trees all die, and you end up with nothing. In cases like that, it's smarter to start out with one little area and to focus on planting just that, caring for that. Say you plant a mango tree. You care for it for a couple years, and then when they give their first crop of mangoes, you collect the seeds and plant them. The same with the second crop. That way you gradually enlarge your orchard until you fill your whole plot of land. So if you find that focusing on the breath here and there in the beginning of the meditation gets you distracted, just focus down on one spot and stay right there. Tell yourself, you're not going anywhere else. You may want to use the word Buddha to help keep things under control, but just use one spot in the body. It might be right between your eyes, the middle of the forehead, wherever you feel is closest to the center of your awareness in the body. You stare right down, right there. The one warning is that you not tighten up around that spot. Think of the area as being open and free-flowing. In other words, the blood can flow in, the blood can flow out. Energy flows in, energy flows out, but you are not moving. You're going to stay right here. No matter what happens, you're going to stay right in this one little spot. That can gather the mind together and keep it there. You're not trying to take care of too many things at once. Other people find that one spot is not enough. In that case, you might want to try 2 spots. There was an old school teacher I knew who had come to meditation late in life. After she retired, she went to stay at Wat Asokaram. She found that the easiest way to get her mind down, she told me once, well before I was ordained, was to focus on 2 spots, one right between the eyes, the other at the base of the spine. She'd try to keep both spots going at once. In her case, she said, it was like connecting the two poles of a battery. As soon as the two poles were connected, things lit up inside. That enabled her to get the mind into concentration really quickly. What all this shows is that concentration is an individual matter. Different people find that their minds settle down in different ways. And there's room in the practice of concentration for you to experiment and see what works for you. There's no one ideal method that's going to suit everybody, and the whole purpose of the concentration is for the mind to settle down with something it likes, something it finds interesting. The Iddhapada, or bases for success, basically say that concentration will succeed by stressing one of 4 different qualities. For some people, it's fired by desire. For others, persistence, the energy of stick-to-it-ividness. Other people find that concentration works best when it's based on the quality of intent, when you dive in and give it your entire attention. Other people find that analysis works. It's by analyzing the breath, by making it interesting, and finding that it really is interesting, the way the breath energy flows in the body, how it can be very different from what you might expect, by playing with it, by experimenting with it, that you find yourself absorbed in the present, not because you're forcing yourself to be there, but simply because you get interested, just as you can get absorbed, say, in painting a picture. As a child, I used to find that drawing would have me absorbed for hours. I'd be working on a drawing and I'd have no sense of the passage of time. It'd be time for dinner before I knew it. And the same can work in your meditation as you learn to analyze the breath. You pull yourself into the present moment not with any force, but simply through the power of your curiosity. Some people, though, find that analyzing things like this gets them distracted. You start thinking about the breath, and then you start thinking about your stomach, and then about the doctor who looked after your stomach, and all of a sudden you find yourself 30 miles away. In that case, your meditation may succeed based either on the desire to stay here or the effort to stay focused on just one spot, or being intent on one spot or on 2 spots, whatever you find works. So there's room for experimentation. There's room for you to learn what works for you. Keep this in mind as you practice. Sometimes you've got to use your ingenuity. As Ajahn Fuang once noted, all the elements in really well-balanced concentration are there in the 7 steps in Ajahn Lee's instructions. The problem is simply that different people will find different steps to be the ones that really pull them in. Once they've been pulled in by one of the steps, they've got to balance out the other ones. You're here, right where all the action is. Ajahn Lee talks about finding your one spot in the body and staying focused there. But some people miss this step because it comes after the steps that tell you to explore the breath throughout the body. But the steps don't have to be done in sequential order. Think of them as different component factors of concentration. You may have to start out with just the one spot. Once that's established, you can develop the other components. In other words, you stay focused in your one spot and then see how it's related to the area right around it. Then radiating out from there, you look at the areas right around that until you've got the whole body in your frame of awareness, even though you're still really staring down on the one spot. You can't help but be aware of the body. In other words, you don't totally blank out the rest of the body. After all, the purpose of concentration is to be aware all around as a basis for discernment. Discernment can arise only when you're aware all around. If your concentration is the sort that blocks things out, it's not going to be a good basis for discernment. You won't see unexpected connections. You'll have huge blind spots in your range of awareness where all kinds of things can hide. So one way to start is to go right for one spot and then gradually expand from there. But if you find that too confining, if the mind rebels against being forced into one spot, you can have it range around your body. Notice how the breath feels in the toes, how it feels in the fingers, how it feels in the arms and the back, how your posture affects the breath, how your breath affects the posture. In other words, use the meditation as an opportunity to explore. This is one of the good things about the breath as a focal point for meditation. You can use it both as an object to stare at and as an object to analyze. If you find that the mind needs more tranquility before it's going to get anywhere, okay, you can just settle down and be very, very still. It's almost like you're not even watching the breath. You're more focused on the direction in which your awareness is beamed. You're preoccupied with just keeping the beam steady. The one danger you have to watch out for there, of course, is that you might clamp down on the blood circulation in that spot. So watch out for that. Allow things to come in and go out, but you stay at that one spot as consistently as possible. But as for the connections you can see when you use the breath as an object for discernment, they're infinite. We were talking earlier this morning about name and form and how they play a role in the arising of suffering. Well, they also play a role in the path leading to the end of suffering. You've got form, which is the form of the body, the four great elements, and the breath is the most prominent element. You've got perception, whatever perceptions you have of the breath, whatever ways you have of conceiving the breath. That's an effective way of getting the mind to settle down, simply by holding that perception in mind. You pay attention, which is another element of form. You've got the intention to stay, and then you've got the feeling that arises when you try to create a feeling of ease. In other words, instead of allowing these things to happen willy-nilly, you try to bring as much awareness and clarity to how they function in bringing the mind to stillness. So these elements, which if left to their own devices based on ignorance would lead to suffering, you're now playing with them, all the while being very aware of how they interact. This is one of the best ways of learning their interactions, by playing with them. You adjust your attention or your intention and see what happens to the feeling. You change your perception and see what effect it has on the mind. What we're doing is to take the basic causes of suffering and to bring as much awareness to them as possible, specifically awareness in the form of the Four Noble Truths. Where is there stress? What are you doing that's causing stress, and what can you change to make the stress go away? You start with blatant levels of stress related to how you're sitting here breathing, trying to get the mind to settle down, and then from there, you grow sensitive to levels that are more and more subtle. You're here right where all the action is. It's simply a matter for you individually to figure out exactly where you can get your first handle on these issues. Establish that as your beachhead, and then from there, your understanding will begin to spread out. There will come times in the meditation when you begin to think that just being very still right here is kind of stupid. Nothing is going to happen, and you wonder what else is there to do next. Well, ask yourself, who says that it's stupid? Why do you need to push the what's next? Those are perceptions right there. Right there, you've got some issues you can work through. Everything you need to know for the purpose of putting an end to suffering is right here. Just bring a lot of alertness to it, a lot of mindfulness to it, and notice what works for you in getting the mind to settle down. That's how insight arises, by seeing what works. That's the way the Buddha tested all of his insights. Did they work? In other words, he was looking for pragmatic truth, the knowledge that would make a difference. As for truths that wouldn't make a difference, he just put them aside. He was very single-minded in his quest. Whatever was necessary for putting an end to suffering, he focused on that. Whatever wasn't necessary, he might know it, but he didn't let it clutter up his mind. As he said in describing his awakening, he learned the equivalent of the leaves of the forest. What he brought out to teach, in terms of focusing on the issue of suffering, its cause, its end, and the path to its end. That's just like a handful of leaves, but it's precisely the handful you need. If you were to make a comparison with medicine, there can be lots of medicine in the forest, but just this one handful is what you need for your specific disease. As for the other leaves, if they're not helpful for your disease, Why bother with them right now? The mind has this disease of ignorance, craving, greed, anger, and delusion. And if we don't take care of it, it's going to fester, going to cause a lot of suffering for a long time to come. So focus on the leaves that will cure it. As for the other leaves in the forest, you can pay attention to them after you've got this specific disease cured. So everything you need to know is right here. It's simply a matter of paying attention. See which perceptions work, which perceptions don't work, which ways of paying attention work and which ones don't, which intentions work and which don't. Just by exploring these issues, you can learn an awful lot about the mind and make a big change in the mind as well.